Well, hello, I am Dave Sterrett. This is Disruptive Truth. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Kevin VOST, who holds a doctorate of clinical psychology from Adler University. And he has taught at a number of schools, including the University of Illinois in Springfield and Aquinas College in Nashville. He has written a number of books, and we're going to talk about two of them today, including this book called The Porch and the Cross: Ancient Stoic Wisdom for Modern Christian Living. And then, Dr. Kevin VOST, you have a new book just came out called Memorize the Stoics. And I came across your book because I'm a Christian, and I have just noticed that there has been an increased interest in Stoicism. We're back in the 2000, early 2000s. You had your New Atheists, and you had a lot of books with your Sam Harris's type, who believed in more of a strong determinism, and that free will was an illusion. And then you had more of your very, some of the self-help books by, that Oprah was endorsing, like Eckhart Tolle. But now I see this increased shift of Stoicism. And I'm just curious, before we get started, why do you believe that there's such an increased interest in Stoicism?
Yeah, that's a great question, an important question. I've seen, exactly the trends that you're talking about over the years. And just for a slight bit of background, I'll let you know that there was a period of time for about 25 years, 1978 to 2004. Is that right? 2000, yeah, where I considered myself an atheist.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, not from the new school of Dawkins, but from the old timers: Friedrich Nietzsche,
Okay.
Ayn Rand, Bertrand Russell. So it's kind of a long story. I read kind of some of the wrong philosophers when I was young. But at the same time, the Stoics, I came across them through my study in psychology, because many of our best modern methods of psychotherapy, called cognitive therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy, they have their roots in the Stoic philosophy. The Stoics knew a lot about making us feel better and feel calmer. So I know some people come to Stoicism now who've had experience with these cognitive therapies, and they've learned about these Stoic roots. Hey, this is a way that I can, better control my emotions. I'm not so darn angry all the time or worried about things. So there's that therapeutic angle. But what I think too, though, is, what's happened in recent decades, when we've kind of thrown out so much of our traditional morality from the public square. Things like the Ten Commandments, basic biblical teachings are almost taboo in many places now. So I think there's a real hunger among people for some real sturdy moral values, for some ideas that focus on things like truth and being noble and being honest and being good. And at a natural level, based on human reasons, the Stoics do a very, very good job of this. And another thing I think is really wonderful too, now, they're not Christians. They didn't know Christ, and most of the main figures lived before we had the Bible, before there was widespread knowledge. But early Christian thinkers loved much of what the Stoics said, because they used that God-given reason that God gave us,
right,
and came up to some really nice conclusions. And in a fuzzy way, it even led them to God. So, but in general, I notice today, as taking part, in the Christian world and in the Stoic world, that in that Stoic world, there are people there who are Christians, who are Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox. There are people who are Buddhists and Hindus, and there are people who are atheists and agnostics. But I think what makes it so popular, it is reaching that common core of just natural God-given reason, basic sense of right and wrong, kind of common sense approach to morality that so much of the world seems to be really starving for now.
Yes. And I think it, in one sense, is a breath of fresh air, right? Because those, like, I first came across it. I saw a video of Ryan Holiday, and he wrote this book called The Daily Stoic.
Oh,
and
yes,
then
I've
I
read
started
that.
looking it up, and I realized, well, who's teaching this? And I got this edition of Marcus Aurelius, and this is a edition by Gregory Hayes, who's a professor of classics at the University of Virginia. And then I came across your books, and just reading this, the Porch and the Cross, it's fascinating. And I think one of the things, we're talking about taking human responsibility, and there's a lot of application towards relationships, to the way we view work, the way we view philosophy. So maybe just right now, for our audience sake, in helping me to just, can you tell us just what are some of the key tenets of Stoicism? What makes Stoicism Stoicism?
Sure, sure. And one of the fundamentals is in the Stoic Epictetus, who inspired Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, whose book you're reading with the Meditations. But
Yeah.
there's a little book of Epictetus called the Handbook. It's just kind of a collection of his sayings, only 25 or 30 pages long. But the first sentence says, some things are under our control, some things are not under our control. So that's kind of our starting point.
Yeah.
And the Stoic teaching is we want to focus our energies on the things that we actually can control and not get too disturbed by the things that are outside of our control. And the things outside of our control could be almost anything that could happen to us in the outside world, or the way other people treat us, whether they respect us or not, how they interact with us. So the Stoic let's focus on what we can control. I can control my own thoughts to some extent. I can probably control my own emotions to a greater extent than I think I can. So that's one of the starting grounds. Oh, it's also kind of like the basis of the serenity prayer, right?
Right.
That God give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
That's Stoicism, in a
It
kernel
is.
there. But the other key phrase, and just one more, this is the one these modern cognitive psychologists and psychiatrists really pulled from. It's in his 5th little chapter of his handbook. And he says, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of things. So it's really this idea that what disturbs us, what upsets us, what gets us angry, what makes us sad, what makes us fearful. A very important aspect is not just what happens to us, but how we interpret it and how we deal with it. So the Stoics are very useful in interpersonal relationships, with your spouse, with your family, with your coworkers. Because if you really imbue what they're teaching, you'll learn how not to get so upset with them. Like one of their tenets is, let's say someone does something and you find it insulting or disrespectful. You can keep in mind the Stoics would say what that person did in some way that made sense to them at the time. Now, you may disagree that it is really the right thing to do, but you'll keep that in mind. Well, somehow that made sense to them, but I'm not going to let it disturb me.
I can see how that can play out with our, I'm newly got married this last year, and learning the dynamics of that, and it's wonderful. But at the same time, just, I've been single a long time in my life, and there can be misconceptions. I have a new job. I moved from Dallas to Columbus, Ohio, and I'm in medical sales. And so I have new accounts, new doctors, new relationships. And sometimes I think Stoicism can help us in the sense that we realize that we can show empathy, and we realize that we don't have to control everything. And I think this might be a breath of fresh air to some of the atheists who believed in a strong determinism, or the Protestant Calvinists who would hold to such a strong view that whether things are determined by the Calvinists, by God, or by, say, the naturalistic atheist that says that we're determined by our genetic makeup. Stoicism seems to allow that, to admit, to say, look, there are some things we can't control, but we can control our response and our attitude towards the issues and the things that we face. Would that be a fair summary?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In another place, Epictetus gives this little analogy of God as the great playwright. And our job is to play our roles well. And sometimes, God will put different actors. He'll set up props for us, the people we happen to know and meet, So that stuff is coming from the outside. We don't control all that. Yeah. But we always have the ability to ad lib to some extent. We determine how we're going to interact with those people we come across. We're going to interact to what the events happen in our lives, to what new city we're in now, what new relationship we're in now. Well, those are externals that are real, and we can't control those people, but we can control the way we choose to interact with them. So it is a way that saying like, in the physical world, there is determinism in the sense that there's cause and effect relationships out there, of course. But we as human beings, we also are causal agents. Through the choices that we make, we can control even things we may not realize, like our own emotions, which can impact on how we relate to others. So that is a crucial Stoic lesson. That in that sense, they would be very counter to the overly deterministic atheists, or like you say, some of the Calvinists that say that it's just everything's absolutely preordained from God. And I think the Stoics would say that those who believed in some kind of God, which many did, that God, may know everything that's going to happen, but he has given us the capacity to make choices to help determine our own the own outcomes of our own lives.
Hmm. You mentioned that some of the church fathers had a high view of Stoicism, and
Mhm,
even maybe some of the scholastics as well. Do you
mhm.
do any people come to mind that stand out that had a high view of the Stoics that had also a Christian faith?
Yes, yes, and there's some old figures early in the church. Well, Saint Justin Martyr is one of our earliest people. He wrote a letter to the emperor, who was the emperor right before Marcus Aurelius, in fact, explaining some of the Christian faith to him. So he was one that had a respect for the Stoics. An old theologian named Origen is another one. People may be familiar with Saint Jerome, Saint Augustine. They had some
Mhm.
familiarity there. We found that over the centuries, this Epictetus' little handbook, they've actually found at least 3 Christianized adaptations of this book that were used in Christian monasteries. So, boy, this is really good advice. If the monks took Epictetus' advice, they'd probably get along a lot better with each other. So they actually go through the handbook, and like some places, like Epictetus will talk about Socrates, and they might actually change that to St. Paul,
Yeah.
or he'll talk about Zeus, and they'll change that to God. So they've Christianized it. They'll also like point out scriptural verses that are similar message to what Epictetus said. So that was very useful. But then later in the Middle Ages, 12th, 13th century, people like St. Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the people I specialize in, he spoke Latin. So he read the Stoic Seneca, who wrote in Latin. And he mined a lot of really good stuff from him when he's talking about things like anger and how to control it, about virtues like gratitude and clemency. So the Stoics, where they got things right, and I'm not saying they got everything right, they wrote things that most Christians are not going to agree with. But that's really just a small percentage of what they wrote. And much of what they wrote, I think in a way can help us become better Christians, because, what's Jesus told us to do above all else? Love God with all that we are and love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yeah.
But I say it's hard to be so loving and to focus on God if you're always angry and upset or depressed. And the Stoics can help us rein that stuff in so we can really focus on what's important.
That's excellent. Well, can you help us here? And I just want us to maybe go through some of these, like, for example, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Musonius Rufus was one of the first
Mhm.
writers, and you said that he was a pro-life Stoic. What do you mean by that, and in what way? What was his contribution to Stoicism?
Yeah, and this is something that surprised me, because I've known the Stoics for almost 40 years now. The main figures, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, are the 3 later ones. We have
Yes.
most of their writings. And I knew Musonius Rufus was Epictetus' teacher, but I had never heard Epictetus' own firsthand work until I came across these 21 lectures that we have. And it really surprised me how clearly what we call pro-life Musonius Rufus was, because some of the ancient philosophers, we couldn't say that for them. But he actually came out and just praised large families, what a glorious thing it is to see a group of children led by their parents, or to see a grandfather led around by his grandchildren. Really, really praised family, praised marriage, saying it's there for us so we can have children, so the husband and wife can love each other endearingly for the rest of their life. And he even explicitly speaks out against abortion. He says lawmakers are right to prohibit abortion. These are human beings made in God's image, and we shouldn't be restricting it. So,
Now, what was
I'm
the
a
view of
Catholic.
that in ancient Rome? Now, he would have been what century? This would have been
First
third.
century.
Okay, first century. Okay.
Mhm.
So, what would his view? I mean, would have been accepted? Were there others who followed his teaching? How influential is that? Because often we as a Christian, we emphasize that the pro-life emphasis was uniquely Christian,
Mhm.
but there were some in Rome. You're saying some of the Stoics who held this high view, or was he kind of counterculture in his theory?
Well, yeah, I'd say to some extent he may have been countercultural, because at times there too in ancient Rome, I mean, young children could be exposed. If the father decided there was something wrong with them, they go expose them. And in Greece too. So, but Musonius was definitely opposed to that. So he was countercultural in some ways in how strongly he spoke about these family issues. So, for example, even though Epictetus was his student, and there is a story once that Epictetus married a woman and adopted a child because the child, for the child's sake, later on in his life. But I don't know if the other Stoics that explicitly addressed the abortion issue like Musonius Rufus did. But he's ahead of his time in some other ways too. in a time when some people thought philosophy is for men alone. He said, no, women need philosophy just as much as men do. They should be trained in it because, a man needs to be courageous and to be able to control himself and to be just and have wisdom. A woman needs that just the same. She has her own duties and responsibilities, and she needs philosophy just as much as women. So I would say Musonius Rufus, most modern Stoics, if they haven't read Musonius Rufus, they may not be aware of the strong current in there. But part of the reason I like it is because some people who don't hold the pro-life position would say, well, don't impose your religion on me. But the Stoics like Musonius Rufus say, yes, but there's also just pure human reason can lead us to this same idea that every human life is of value and none should be taken before they're born.
So that is an excellent point there. What would he say to this? I'll just throw out some questions here, and you answer these in your book, The Porch and the Cross. But would practice be more important to theory? How would he answer that question?
Yes. Musonius Rufus was very big on practice. The idea proof is in the pudding. And other Stoics would echo him on this, especially Epictetus. They'd say, don't study philosophy just so you can, throw out fancy highfalutin words or give people riddles they can't solve or make people doubt whether they really exist or not. So this is not the role of philosophy.
Right.
The role of philosophy is to guide us towards a good life. And some Stoics even this means to try to make our will match God's will as much as we can discern it. So Musonius Rufus said the most important thing to study philosophy is to teach us how to apply it, how to live well, to really live good lives. And he said, and if we're going to teach others, he said, more important than the explicit teaching and preaching is the example we set by living a good life like that.
Yeah, so it's really applied ethics that
Yes.
you see in the Stoics where, I years ago, about 10 years ago, I earned a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Dallas, and we studied the ancients, and we read some of the Stoics, but I had forgotten, and I've just seen this resurgence, and there's often people from the business world who are dealing with relationships, or counselors who are talking about Stoicism and how do we apply this to our lives. Now, you mentioned Epictetus, and he is probably one of the big three. Tell us a little bit about his story. How did he go from being a slave to a philosopher?
He's an interesting story for sure, because we believe his name, the Greek name Epictetus, means acquired, like something purchased or bought. So his history was that he was a slave, born as a slave. At some point in time, as a young adult, he was allowed, his master recognized his genius, and he was allowed to go study with this Musonius Rufus. Now, Musonius Rufus was a Roman of the equestrian class, or the knights. They were a step below the Senate, but they were pretty dignified, or people with a higher class at that point in Rome. So Epictetus studied with him. At one point in his life, he gained his freedom, and then he spent the rest of his life simply as a teacher of philosophy, living a simple life, teaching scores and scores of, or hundreds or thousands of people over the years. But Epictetus, there's one really famous story about him. It said when he was still a slave, he said at one time one of his masters was twisting his leg, and Epictetus calmly said, "Excuse me, but if you keep twisting my leg with that, it's going to break." And then pop. And Epictetus said, "Well, see, I told you so." So actually later in his life, he often called himself a lame old man. He kind of hobbled around through the rest of his life. But he's the kind of person to teach you, no matter what kind of physical problems you have or what you encounter, you can live a good life. And in fact, he wrote about freedom more than any other Stoic, but they're saying it doesn't necessarily mean just not being a slave, in the sense of the slaves like they had than actual slaves. He means being free in terms of controlling your own self, not being the slave to your own emotions, your own lusts, your own passions. So Epictetus, this former slave, was one of the great champions of freedom.
Wow, that's excellent. It's often, people have this idea about freedom that if I just do this, then I can really be free. Or even our children, thinking if they are allowed to have their smartphones and their technology, they can be free. But it's often freedom that says, no, I don't need that. Or it's freedom to say no and to control our desires and our emotions. Tell us about some of the influence of Seneca. You call him the silver-tongued Stoic stylus.
I like alliteration a lot.
Yes. Tell us about his life and some of his contribution and his ideas about, things about worldly wise and elegant and eloquent. And what were some of his contribution?
Yeah, well, I like him too because he's such a different person from Epictetus. Seneca comes from Spain, from a wealthy family. He comes to Rome. He's this equestrian knight class too. He eventually becomes one of two closest advisors to the Emperor Nero. Now, many people may think, Nero, oh my gosh, what a mess. Well, that's true. But in his younger years, the Seneca and this man Burrus were his main advisors, and the empire actually went along fairly well until Nero completely went off the rails and killed his own mother. Later, many decades later, actually ordered Seneca himself to kill himself. But yeah, Seneca was this incredible writer. He wrote fiction, he wrote these non-fictional essays, and he had really beautiful wording. I mean, he really knew how to make things pithy, make little sayings, and so on.
So your next book is Memorize the Stoics. So I might put you on the spot. Can you tell us a quote of his or something that stands out that you've memorized that stands out as one of your favorite sayings that he said?
Okay. Man who, I'm going to try to remember the exact wording of this one because I usually just do their key concepts.
You can paraphrase.
But they put it in form of a rhyme, though. It said, I'm sorry. He has a quote about, it rhymes though, about the man who is, we have to edit this.
Oh, that's all right.
No, but it's basically saying that the man who is rich is never poor is the man who's always the man who's truly poor is always hankering for more. Basically, no matter how rich that he is.
Yes.
But many of his, it's hard too because he has like 124 letters he wrote to this younger friend of his named Lucilius. And each one of them is just chock full of these sayings, and he's always finds a way to make them very, very wordy and very, very pithy. So in that way, he's so different from Epictetus. And also, he's different in the sense that, like the later Christians, they admired Musonius Rufus, they admired Epictetus. But Seneca might have been a bit of a hypocrite because he was like an extremely wealthy man who counseled the possible riches of poverty and things like that. But part of his story seems to be, as a younger man, he was a social climber. He became in the court of Nero himself. Later, he grew into Stoicism. He valued virtue more and more, but he's like entangled in that web with Nero. And at one point, he tried to give all his riches back to Nero, but Nero wouldn't have them. So he was kind of stuck until towards the end of his life in his late 60s. Nero had ordered him actually to commit suicide.
What would you say would be some of the Stoic idea? Is there a common idea towards wealth? I know, like with Christianity, there's different opinions. You have some Christians who really believe that wealth can be a tool for good. Others kind of believe that, it's the love of it can lead to the root of all evil. And what would you say that with Stoics, their view towards the relationship between work and finances? What would be some of their major takeaways with money?
Yeah, for one thing, the Stoics are on controlling your emotions and things, but they're also on relationships. They're also on roles and duties. And like the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, even himself, in one of his quotes, he says to himself, "Hey, don't sit here lying in bed, sleepyhead. Yeah, I need to rise and do the work of a human being." And this is the Emperor of Rome, the mightiest man in the world, right? So he said, we do have responsibilities. We need to be productive, to care for our families, to offer, goods to society. But they do count material things and wealth as what they would call not ultimate goods, not true goods, but things that are more indifferent, but can be preferred indifference. Yes, we'd rather be wealthy in most cases than poor, but we're never going to do anything immoral or unjust to attain that wealth because it's a secondary thing. And many of them do point out too that, if you justly and honestly acquire success and acquire wealth, it can put you in a position, of course, to do good for other people. So it's not like they're saying that, they're opposed to a person who would acquire a lot of money or work real hard. They would be opposed to the idea that that's your primary goal. They'd say your primary goal is to be an honest person, to be a good person, to do good for the society.
The virtue is your character first and foremost. Well, tell us here, I want to jump into your book, Memorize the Stoics, but before we do that, could you give us just a little bit of a historical overview of Marcus Aurelius and his contribution? He may be is it fair to say that he's probably the most famous Stoic?
Yes, I think he is. And he's so interesting because, and here's all these contrasts with the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius was the Roman emperor. And when Edward Gibbon wrote the famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he talks about these last 5 good emperors. And Aurelius was number 5, the last before things went downhill. And he was emperor from 169 to 180 AD. And kind of the cool thing about him is what drew him into philosophy more than anything else was Epictetus. Epictetus was his go-to guy. So here is the emperor of Rome at the time, the mightiest kingdom on earth. And the guy he studies is this little former slave, Epictetus. So really kind of a cool thing there. And Epictetus, part of the reason he's so admired, he wrote these meditations, which was really kind of like just a book to himself. And a lot of times he did it when he's on the frozen banks of the Danube. He was leading Roman armies, defending the borders from various tribes. And he would retire at night and try to calm and soothe himself by writing these Stoic reflections. And now for almost, 1900 years or something, people have been drawing their own solace from his really deep reflections on the meaning of life. Some people call him like one of the true philosopher kings. And another reason he is so admired, we have that saying that, power corrupts and complete power corrupts completely, that kind of thing. Right. He was a man, he was undoubtedly, literally the most powerful man in the world, but it does not seem to have corrupted him. He is far more interested in being a good man than being a mighty man. And in fact, one of his other sayings, he repeats a time or two in his meditations, is he goes, basically, don't become a Caesar. Don't become Caesarified. Don't walk around thinking I'm the most powerful man in the world, thinking I'm a man with a job to do.
It's very fascinating, and you're inspiring me to read more and to learn from your books and to go through both of these great books in detail. Hold on up there for the camera there to see. We're talking about the Porch and the Cross, and our guest today is Dr. Kevin VOST, and also memorizes Stoics. Can you talk to us a little bit about this book, Memorize the Stoics? Why did you write this book?
Well, I will say too, because it kind of dovetails to my 2 specialty areas in psychology. In the therapy, I like the cognitive therapies, which drew from the Stoics. My own particular area of expertise was memory. I did a master's thesis on memory training techniques for adolescents, and my doctoral work was at an Alzheimer's center where we tested people's memories, and I did some memory rehab work with some people, certain kinds of brain damage, using these special memory techniques that ancient Greeks developed, Romans passed on, and then later even some Christian writers like St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas talked about these certain methods. And I'll explain too the gist of this book and why I couldn't off the top of my head come up with a Seneca quote. Because the main use of these methods they can be used for direct quotes, but they're mainly used for memory for things or concepts. Okay. So for example, with Seneca, with Epictetus, I go through the 53 chapters of his Handbook. And I give you not necessarily exact quotes, but key ideas. Like this first one is, I remember I said the first line is, some things are under our control, some things are not under our control. Well, I have you visualize, you open this front door, the first location, and you see a jet fighter's control a cockpit, and you see 2 control panels. So you have this image in your head, control panels. That's where they talk about what's called the dichotomy of control. Now, it helps that there was later a famous American Stoic, James Stockdale, who was an actual jet fighter, shot down during the Vietnam War, knew Epictetus and said, Epictetus, I'm entering his world now, and this is what's going to help me survive as a prisoner of war, actually. And it did for almost 8 years. So anyway, the key to this book is I go through Epictetus's 53 chapters and give you just one key idea you can remember. Like for Seneca, then, I go through the first 50 of his letters, and I do that too. Like the first one for Seneca, the front door opens, and this huge clock flies past your head. Well, why is that? One of his first lessons is the value of time and not to let it fly past you. So then you do this for all the other concepts. Some are kind of wacky.
It helps me even right now. I'm already thinking about the cockpit. I'm thinking about the clock flying through. Now, this book here, tell us, because I'm almost done with this one. And I just thank you so much. We got this. I think, and by the way, for our audience, where's the best way that I got this one off Amazon here? Where do you recommend that the audience buys the Porch and the Cross and also memorizes Stoics?
Well, the publisher is the same for both of those. It's called Angelico Press.
Okay.
So you could go to their website, see what they have, but I believe their main links will lead you to Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But I know there's other internet sellers too. So hopefully they're out there. They're out there in a lot of places. And I will say too, the Memorize the Stoics is special to me because it's illustrated. Because when you go through these memory exercises, you form all these pictures in your head, like the rooms of a house or even the Stoic porch itself. And my daughter-in-law drew those. So it kind of tries to guide you step by step through this process. And then once you learn them, I mean, you'll actually learn them kind of forwards and backwards. You'll know where these ideas are. So if you come across a situation in your life where something's daunting you, you can think back, oh yeah, Epictetus said that, I'm not really disturbed by things. I'm disturbed by the views I take of things. And you'll remember exactly where that came in if you wanted to look it up and
so I'm looking here, the front door, jet fighter, control panel, doormat, desire, the discipline of desire, glass panel, a child crying over a broken pot. So remember the nature of things. There's a portrait on a back wall, gun rack, and you use these symbols here to help visualize. All right, this is good. Can you walk us through another one? Is there another one that stands out in this book?
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you one, because the way these rooms are laid out, you get a foyer, you get a living room, you get a dining room.
And tell me about the whole concept of the rooms. Was that developed by the Stoics, or the whole idea?
The idea is attributed to a man a little bit before the Stoics named Simonides, a Greek orator.
Wow.
And it was passed on through Cicero, the 1st century BC Roman statesman and philosopher and writer. And Cicero's kind of an interesting character because we know a lot about the Stoics through him, and we know a lot about this memory method through him.
So can you summarize this memory method for us? Just the method. How does because you've used this and you've written other books on Christianity and Thomas Aquinas and
Thomas Aquinas boils it down in 4 little steps. He says to perfect your memory, you do 4 things, and 2 of them we already know. Numbers 3 and 4, he says if you want to really remember something, you've got to concentrate. You have to pay attention, right? You have to focus. We all know that. The 4th is repetition or rehearsal. You practice. You do it again and again. We all know that too. But these 2 special elements of what's called the art of memory, or the artificial memory. The first is, he says, whatever you want to remember, make some visual image of it, something you can picture in your mind's eye. Like even if it's an abstract or spiritual concept. That's why I like this idea of the dichotomy of control. We actually picture a control panel, right? It's something you can picture. And Thomas says that's how we learn information. We see what comes in from our senses. So you need to make an image of it. He also says you need to put it in an orderly arrangement. And actually, the oldest memory book we have from the 1st century BC, the first example it gives is use a house. So, all of us, in our day, we're familiar with houses. So I just go through it's sort of like my own house, front door's number 1 and the doormat's number 2, the glass panel looking out the front yard's 3, this portrait on the wall is number 4. And I go through a whole house. I go through 50 different images, 50 different rooms. But the idea is, well, whatever you remember in the 7th image, well, that's from the 7th chapter of Epictetus. Or if we're on Seneca, that's from his 7th letter, So it puts everything in its right place. And once you learn the rooms, they are like a notepad in your head. And you can use them over and over again for absolutely anything. Like when I do public speaking, when I do talks, I memorize the key points of my talk in a house like this. So when I'm giving my talk, I'm kind of walking through my own house. Oh yeah, this is the idea I put there. This is what I'm going to talk about next. I'll put that on my doormat, So it's very, very, very flexible. It can be used over and over again. And if I give you one more example of a kind of a wacky image, because sometimes these images need to be kind of weird because we forget things that are ordinary and mundane. So you make them kind of strange.
Yeah.
But I came to Epictetus, the 9th chapter, where he talks about this fundamental concept of his. He calls proheresis in the Greek. It's kind of our ability to make choice. Some people translate it as our will or our moral purpose. I thought, well, how am I going to get people to remember the word proheresis? So I think, okay, a lot of people have seen Star Wars and they know Yoda, right?
Right.
So I say, imagine on this little bench, which is a 9th location, you see Yoda and he's sitting next to this very, very hairy professional athlete. And Yoda says, pro-hairy he is. So just that little word pun. Proheresis gives you, oh yeah, he was talking about proheresis, But then, of course, in the commentary, then we dig deep and what does this really mean?
Yeah.
So the whole book's structured like that.
Well, that is fascinating. And I like these tools. I'm looking forward to jumping into this book, Memorize the Stoics. And also, I just think that this is important I see that there's wisdom here. I think a lot of people and most of most of my audience, we work with people who do not believe the way we do. There are people who are atheists, but often in your company, there's a common good. Yes. And we're dealing with relationships. We're on different teams. We have to collaborate for a common good. Like my full-time day job is helping, sell a treatment and to facilitate that to cancer patients. And regardless of one's political views or regardless of, the restrictions that I have access to oncologists because of COVID, we can use and we can implement these principles of Stoicism to find common ground. And also absolutely. In our own lives so that we can realize that, we can control the things that we can't control, but we don't have to worry about the things that are out of our control as well. And I think that will help a lot of people in business. And, I think there might be some pushback from some, I'm a Protestant Christian. And so sometimes in some circles, there's a pushback, well, it's not all I need is the Bible. All I need is, when I would push back and say, isn't it true that when Paul met with the Stoics and Epicureans, he was intelligent enough to observe and to actually quote their own philosophers a couple of times. Exactly. And he was very well aware. And you know what? All truth is God's truth. The same person who might push back on, why spend time memorizing the Stoics? Well, they've probably memorized some lines from Yellowstone or their favorite country artists or their favorite song from the 70s. They've memorized those lyrics. And if we can enjoy or even, learn things from entertainment, why not learn virtue to help sharpen our ideas? And one thing it does with me, and I'm probably talking too much, our audience wants to hear from you, is I think helps us to, a lot of things as Christians, we just assume, we just hear it, and we just assume it to be true, and we don't really think about it. But this can help us to think about it in a different angle, in a different way. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I would. And I would say too, Dave, within the Catholic world, there's people have different views, and there are some you'd almost get the impression, well, if a pope didn't say it or a saint didn't say it or it's not in the Bible, I don't need to know that, But like you said, Jesus Christ himself said, I am the way and the truth and life. Jesus is truth. And and a follower of Jesus, you're never going to fear any truth, And some truths kind of with a small t can come from our reason if we use it the right way. So I think the Stoics can be a great bridge to people with no faith, with little faith, with different faith. And I just was thinking one thing too, that you're in the medical sales profession is that a couple of years ago, and it happened to be right before all this COVID stuff hit, I was asked to do a talk for the Catholic Medical Association. And the topic then was physician burnout. Wow. So many doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals feel like they were being burned out by all the demands on them. So one of the things I tried to bring in there to help them out is some of these Stoic ideas there. To help you deal with those particular stresses within your medical profession. So they can be used in virtually whatever field that you're in. There's probably something of value you can get out of the Stoics.
Absolutely. Well, this is very good. Well, for our audience, where should they start? Which book should they get first? The Memorize the Stoics or the Porch and the Cross?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably, the old answer would be, well, both, of course. And then
buy them both.
If you're able to, go back and forth. No, but I'd say if you want just a pure Stoic message and with a special focus on the Christian development, there's the Porch and the Cross. And if you want a lot of good Stoic detail also, but if you're intrigued by this particular memory method, then start with the Memorize the Stoics.
All right. Dr. Kevin VOST, thank you so much for joining the show. I've really enjoyed learning from you, and this is really helping me to learn about the Stoics. And I'm looking forward to exploring these books and really memorizing the Stoics. And I know this book will take a little bit more work, memorize the Stoics, but I'm going to jump into it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, David. It's really been my pleasure.